Andrew Bolt has again indicated that his attitude towards Indigenous people is the only way I can describe it as racist. He propagates versions of the Indigenous community that are so unhelpful and that are damaging towards the efforts that are made in order to improve the outcomes for our First Nations people. I find a lot of what Andrew Bolt says and does pretty generally downright revolting. But I've got three clips here that I want to show you. The first one, so bear with me, stick with this, because I think there's some really important points to be made here. The first clip is Bolt himself talking about how he wishes Indigenous people to be assimilated. Now, I don't know which era Bolt thinks he's in, but clearly he's back in the 30s, 40s and 50s in relation to some of his very extreme views as to how to best fix the Indigenous community's issues. Now, all of us know, and I'm not skipping or avoiding the issues that do sit within Indigenous communities, they are vast. But nevertheless, they are issues which have been here across all political spectrums. And in fair to the Labor government, and particularly to Anthony Albanese, an effort was made. It failed, but at least it was made to provide a voice for Indigenous people so that they can directly say what it is that they believe needs to be done to rectify their situation. So that effort has been made. It has been rejected by the Australian community, regretfully, but then don't sit back like Andrew Bolt does and tell us that the problem basically is assimilation. Take Indigenous people away from the country, pop them into cities where supposedly they do better. You know, that is a bullshit argument, and it's not necessarily what Aboriginal people want. So why don't you, Andrew Bolt, yourself, take yourself out into these communities and ask them what it is that they would like to happen for them and what solutions are best. Now, there have been many examples around Australia where Indigenous people have taken control over their environments and they have improved them. I can remember one particular incident where in Queensland a group of Aboriginal women got together and they just banned alcohol, and that immediately stopped the violence and the bad behaviour that was occurring within their communities. So there are many examples, in fact, where Indigenous people have been able to change what's happening for them. Now, this has all come about now because of some bad behaviour by Indigenous youth in Alice Springs. Now, I'm not specifically sure as to the reason why, apart from the fact that apparently a couple of Indigenous kids had died. I don't know the circumstances around that. I'm sure we'll find out later on. But it has bred a lot of hostility. Hostility that I would suggest has been there for some time, as we well know in Alice Springs, because for whatever reason, the appropriate services have not been provided or the appropriate intervention has failed to be implemented. Whatever the reason is, the solution is not the Andrew Bolt solution. So the first video I've got is one of Andrew Bolt spouting his crap. The second one is of the woman from NAIDAC, the Indigenous organisation that deals specifically with youth, talking about what are the solutions. And the third one is the example of what happens when racism gets fed by people like Bolt. And that is the story that came out today in relation to Eddie Betts. And I think this, I'm not 100% sure, but I think this happened at his home, where somebody drove past and slurred racism crap at his children who were playing basketball, which was revolting and which should never happen, but gets fed by people like Bolt. And this is why I make a stand against any racism at all. And I find that Bolt has this platform through the Liberal Party TV network that allows this sort of conversation to continue and putting forward the arguments that he puts forward that propagate racism, and we must challenge it. And I certainly, for one, am going to challenge it. Now, there'll be plenty of people in my comment section who will disagree, call me a wank, do whatever you like. I don't give a shit. What I do need to do is to make this stand, which I'm doing right now. And I'm playing not all of this, all of the video from Bolt's discussion the other night, but I am going to play what I think are salient sections of it. And it starts off with his advocacy for one of the greatest racists of our time, namely Tony Abbott. And a great deal of criticism, of course, of Albanese, because this is the Liberal TV network and this is what they do. And in fact, Albanese has probably spent more time in Alice Springs or thereabouts and in the Northern Territory than Abbott did while he was Prime Minister. So I'll just play this second for you, and if I need to interrupt it along the way, I simply will.
Goes to Tony Abbott. For decades now, we have been doing exactly the wrong thing with Aboriginal policy. Completely the wrong thing because of a disastrous leftist ideology. And the violence in Alice Springs this week is the proof of it. I mean, never in my life have I seen this kind of lawlessness, this total breakdown of order in some Aboriginal community. I mean, all those tens of billions of dollars we spend on Aboriginal Australians every year on this whole Aboriginal industry, and this is what we get in Alice Springs.
He does seem to forget, I think, that the Liberal Party have been in power for a large majority of this time that he's talking about, and in particularly prior to the current Albanese government for 9 years. And they have failed to do anything, absolutely anything, about this Indigenous problem. So to blame, and it's been a continual problem for many, many governments. I understand all of that. I'm not going to excuse the Labor Party as well for when they were in power for not doing enough. But I do need to at least acknowledge that Albanese tried. Nothing else, he at least tried. It failed because we live in a racist country. It's as simple as that. And that the Yes campaign failed. And this is a great disappointment in putting the issue forward in a very extremely positive way. They didn't counter the No campaign enough. And so many people fell for the type of rubbish that was spread by the No campaign. But anyway, here's Bolt telling us more and more about his version of why nothing has been done. And I have to add, without adding any solutions to the problem.
Liberal Senator Karen Little, who was born, was asking almost all the right questions.
So I asked the question when I looked at that vision, where are the services that were gifted to do their work, the hundreds of millions of dollars that went into Central Australia? Where was the intelligence that told them that there were issues brewing in those town camps? Where was the people who are supposed to be running buses to get people home? Where are the youth services that were supposed to be keeping an eye on these kids? It just seems that the intelligence that informed what was brewing here was absent.
But the one question she didn't ask there is, where were the parents of these children? Yes, that's spending. It does seem that the more we spend, the worse it gets some places. The children, we've never had to rescue and remove so many Aboriginal children ever, despite all the propaganda about the so-called stolen generations, more than 22.
I just need to emphasise that the terminology rescue and remove is offensive. And no one will probably ever pick this up in social media. But I'm certainly going to highlight it because working in child protection has been something I've done for a couple of decades. So I understand what that language means. These children don't all need to be rescued. Some of the issues need to be resolved. I agree. There should not be any sexual assault, particularly domestic violence, of course, and drug use. Those three issues sit right across the spectrum. They're not just unique to Indigenous people. And the reason why Indigenous kids are removed more than ever is because within the organisations responsible for those removals, there is a degree of racism that focuses on those kids, just like, and I've talked about this before, just like there's a degree of bias relating to people that are poor, people that are unemployed, people that have got mental well-being issues and so on. Those people are, the focus is on them, they're the targets, and their kids are removed. The same applies, I think, to the Indigenous community as well. But his rhetoric here tells us that these children simply need to be rescued because they are Indigenous kids. That is crap. Indigenous parents are just as capable of looking after their children as any other parent. The point is that they're targeted to have those kids removed simply because, and I stress this, simply because of the colour of their skin.
Aboriginal children now living out of home care. More than 10 times more likely to have to be removed. So this 2-week curfew on children, that's already been imposed on Alice Springs. That is nothing more than a band-aid. The fact that this was all that the Prime Minister could offer today, and it was actually the Northern Territory government's decision anyway, shows us now bankrupt of ideas.
There has been a temporary curfew put there in Alice Springs. That is a sensible move and one that the federal government supports.
So here's more proof that we've now come to a total dead end with current policies. Spend even more, send in more police, create even more bureaucracies. These aren't the answers long term, you know that. Which may be why the Prime Minister has gone only once to Alice Springs for a few hours 14 months ago and didn't seem keen to go back again when asked by journalists.
I have visited the Northern Territory 9 times. My minister, Linda Burney, was in Alice Springs at the beginning of last week.
Oh, she was there, was she? And did exactly.
And I just need to add that that was more times than what Tony Abbott spent in the Northern Territory and Alice Springs. And Tony Abbott, remember, is their hero around these particular issues because he's done so much for Indigenous people. He did fuck all. And no one talks about that because all they want to do is sell us the idea that Indigenous people are bad people because they live in certain conditions and they live outside of the metropolitan area. It's full of crap, but it's crap that people like Bolt wish to spread all the time.
We have been told that, you know, the real, the authentic Aborigines are very different from the rest of us, and they've got to be kept different. They were the ones out bush in particular, not so much.
I find this particular type of commentary, even as a white person, insulting. It's particularly insulting to, I would imagine, Indigenous people. And it's this sort of rhetoric that propagates racism in this country, and Bolt needs to be held accountable for it.
There too, in touch supposedly with their culture, with their land, not to be really assimilated into this wicked white society. So we poured billions of dollars. I mean, literally billions of dollars, tens of billions, hundreds over the years into welfare programs, deep Aborigines and outback settlements. Where there was often no work, might never be real work, where there was sometimes little hope, few services, and often no reason the children there could see to go to school. And where in some places violence and dysfunction have been the word, been coming from for decades now. Because it was around 25 years ago that I first realised the shocking levels of poverty and violence and child abuse in some Aboriginal communities out there. And realised how crazy it was to spend billions to keep Aboriginal children there. The Aboriginal industry finds it much easier, more lucrative to attack white society. Oh, it's your fault, you know, you owe, you pay us, reparation, whatever. I mean, I know there are many honourable, except for many, it's been much easier to do that than to focus on Aboriginal families and what's now called Aboriginal culture, to focus on personal responsibility. Too hard. Too likely too to get you called racist. And in fact, I'm going to finish with one more anecdote that shows you exactly this whole stinking thing. The Aboriginal industry, the ABC left pushing this dead-end idea that we should keep our Aborigines exactly where they do worst, out bush.
And I like the way he says, so this tells us all about Bolt. This is the way to keep our Aborigines. That is that is one of the most obvious racist comments anybody could make. They are not ours anybody. They are simply Indigenous people, First Nations. They are the owners of this land. They're entitled to the appropriate recognition that we should be giving them, which we have never done. Never. And we did have this opportunity through the referendum and we failed them. It's as simple as that. But the use of the word our tells us all that we need to know about this revolting human being.
You know, almost every Aboriginal leader you see in the media lives in cities and big towns, integrated and assimilated, certainly educated, the big key. In 2015, Mr. Tony Abbott, who you know spent a lot of his free time in the past volunteering in Aboriginal communities, said enough. We could not keep funding the welfare ghettos.
I have no idea as to what time and how much time he spent volunteering in the Indigenous community. I would imagine, haven't got any data on this, that is crap.
Fine, by all means live in a remote location, but there's a limit to what you can expect the state to do for you if you want to live there. What we can't do is endlessly subsidise lifestyle choices if those lifestyle choices are not conducive to the kind of full participation in Australian society that everyone should have.
Listen to the horror from an ABC interviewer when Abbott said it again. We can't keep them out where there is no work. Her reaction was so typical of the left.
And if people choose to live miles away from where there's a school, if people choose not to access School of the Air and the other services that are available for people in very, very remote locations, if people choose to live where there's no jobs, obviously it's very, very difficult to close the gap because without education.
Seeing people for living in remote areas there, isn't that something you should encourage to get people out of the city?
Get Aborigines out of the cities where many have done so well. Now, for raising this issue, Tony Abbott was branded a racist, including by the Greens and by United Nations rapporteur, while leaders of the Aboriginal industry, people who later led the Voice campaign, by the way, lined up to smash Abbott.
I think it's a very disappointing and hopeless statement by the Prime Minister.
What do you make of Tony Abbott's choice of words here?
I think they're poorly thought out. I think they will cause offence in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
On the ABC, Abbott critics, including some identifying as Aboriginal, even claimed that the outback settlements were actually wonderful. They were like Eden. And people backing Abbott on this were just dumb.
These people haven't been out into the regions to see how these people live. They haven't seen how happy the kids are. They haven't seen the power of the elders.
Enough with the fantasies. Let's now have the honest debate that we've been dodging for half a century or more. Is it now time to fund integration instead? Not Aboriginal separatism out there, integration. Is it now time to fund integration instead? Not Aboriginal separatism out there, integration. Time for his haters to apologise.
So that's the whole point. The whole point, according to Bolt, is that these Indigenous people are living in areas in which they can't receive services. So does that mean that in towns like Broome and Townsville and Cairns and even some more remote locations, does that mean that they need to move to the major cities because it's within the major cities that all the services are provided? No, it basically says that we need to do more to provide the services that Indigenous people, but the services Indigenous people want, not the sort of services that we as white people, as politicians, think that they want. The solution lies with Indigenous people. And my frustration with someone like Bolt is that he is so white that he fails to see, even those little clips he played where people were criticising Tony Abbott's response, is a way by which he can have a go at the alternatives and what other people are saying. So other people are saying this is hurtful. I'm saying what you're doing, Andrew Bolt, is as hurtful. Now, I'm just going to play a clip from the ABC today, which talks about what's happening in Alice Springs now and some of the solutions. So stay with me while you watch this, and then I'm going to play the Eddie Betts issue, which soon after this one.
Alice Springs. Catherine, very good morning to you. Thank you very much for joining us on News Breakfast in what's been a very difficult week for your hometown. Just take us through how people are feeling, particularly Aboriginal elders in the town, where, you know, obviously the events this week have been really distressing to witness, but how are you feeling and how are others in the community going?
Yeah, look, I think you nailed it when you used the word distressing. This has been an extraordinary moment in time and people are distressed. And it's a point in time where for Aboriginal people it'd be really easy to be very, very angry. But in actual fact, what we're hearing on the ground from our elders and our leaders is something different. They're talking very strongly, but they're talking softly, because at the heart of what we've seen is the death of 2 young people. And what we know is when we see those incredibly distressing images of children throwing their bodies against glass windows, something is going fundamentally wrong. Children respond to adults, they respond to distress, and it is indicative of something that we're seeing right across the country at this moment in time, when children, we know, are not getting the supports that they need and families are not getting the supports they need. We come into turmoil, and this is the end result of something like that.
Can you give us your assessment of the response from the government and from police? The Chief Minister said she had no other choice but to put in a 2-week curfew. Do you think that was the right measure in response to, as you say, rising distress among Aboriginal children?
Look, I think what we know is there is no one answer. That's the truth. There is never one answer. There is no silver bullet on any of these things. Silver bullets kill werewolves. That's the only thing they were ever designed to do. What we're hearing on the ground from our communities is that we need a circuit breaker. 2 weeks where we can have a chat to people on the ground, where a government actually has to get out, talk to the services about what's going wrong, talk to all elements of that. And that includes police, that includes social services, that includes the health services, it includes everyone that has skin in the game on this. But more importantly, it includes the children that are infected, that are affected, it includes the families that are infected, and it includes our broader community who live and breathe this every single day. Because as I've said, this isn't about one knee-jerk response, this isn't about one event, this is about the 100 little things that could be done that could improve the situation immediately.
We've heard youth workers talking about the homelessness crisis in Alice Springs, actually reminding people that hundreds of children don't have a safe place to go. Are you concerned that for children caught up under the curfew that they don't necessarily have, you know, a safe place to go home to? I mean, some of them may, but others may be going home to a house where there's significant overcrowding, Catherine.
Absolutely, and it's something we spoke very strongly to the Chief Minister about yesterday, and that is, well, who's making the determination about what safety looks like, who's having those conversations with children who might be feeling very, very vulnerable, very, very angry and very, very confused, because again, how we talk about children matters, and how they're perceived in places like the media matters. It impacts on their behaviours. We also asked, where do they go? If this is a case that those children sit amongst the 90% of people in the Northern Territory who are homeless are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If they sit in that cohort, who determines where they go? Who determines what safety looks like? And how do we ensure that we are then working with the families to give them the strengths and the supports that they need? Now, in the long term, what we're seeing, we have seen a couple of big announcements that impact on the Northern Territory, and that is an incredible increase in dollars for housing and an incredible increase in dollars for education. These things will be fundamental, but that'll take time. What we need is those communities' decisions, those community solutions, and we need those to happen really, really quickly.
Yesterday we had
and that is a reasonable response to this problem. And rather than, and of course she's Indigenous, so you're not going to get the Indigenous Bolt type shit coming from her, but it is a confrontation in terms of analysing what actually is happening in Alice Springs and amongst Indigenous communities, and suggesting some solutions and acknowledging that the government is doing something in terms of providing education and housing for those people, which have been issues that Bolt raised, but didn't talk about as being solutions, because Bolt basically has no solutions whatsoever. So this brings me to the final point, and that is that if Bolt is spreading this sort of racism, what impact does it have on the community? Eddie Betts today, great footballer, great Crows man, in fact, and Carlton, of course, but nevertheless, a great individual in terms of his fight for Indigenous rights. And he's experienced enough racism in his life to know what it feels like. But when that racism is imposed upon his children while they're at home, which I think is where this happened, then that puts a completely different and another complexion on this problem. And yesterday, or during this week, he experienced, or his children experienced racism while they were in their home by some dick that was driving past. Now, the point I'm making is that these people's diversion of who they are as white people generally, that have the who believe that they are empowered to say terrible, hurtful things to children, comes about because of people like Andrew Bolt. And we must push back against this form of racism. And so I'm going to play for you that clip. It's an ABC report, and I think it's helpful to understand particularly where Eddie's coming from, because he wants to have a conversation with these people. He doesn't want retribution. He just wants a conversation.
The AFL world has expressed shock this morning after former player Eddie Betts shared a confronting video to his Instagram page, appearing to show security vision of someone driving by a house, repeatedly yelling racist slurs at children playing in a yard. Reporter Steph Ferrier joins us now live from Melbourne. Good morning, Steph. Can you take us through what's happened?
Good morning, Kath. Yes, this is just an absolutely appalling incident, it has to be said, where you can see on the security footage just the reaction from these kids. They're just shocked and quite afraid. They obviously look as if they're scurrying off the court after hearing this really quite abhorrent racist slur directed at them. And Eddie Betts has taken to social media to really call this out. And he says that Aboriginal kids deserve to be able to play safely, free from racism and abuse over the fence. We're not even safe in our own homes. If you know who this is, please let them know that I'm open to having a chat about how much this hurts our kids. And it's not surprising to note that the reaction has been really swift from the sporting world. We've heard stars and also football clubs as well, just absolute in their condemnation of this vile slur. We've heard from Western Bulldogs Football Club saying that they're calling it disgraceful and their thoughts are with Eddie and his family, while Melbourne star forward Christian Petrarca says this is disgusting, thinking of you and the family. And Danelle Wallam, the Firebirds champion, who is also Indigenous, she says that this is absolutely disgusting. But it must be said that, you know, we'd hope that Australia has actually moved on from these sorts of vile attacks, and yet we're seeing this happening to kids of all people.
Yeah, and Steph, this isn't the first time that Eddie Betts has highlighted racism in this country.
No, absolutely. He's been such a staunch advocate for First Nations people, and also someone who has really come out and strongly taken a stance against racial vilification of players both on the field and also online. And he has said that it actually was something that in the early days of his playing career he found really hard to deal with and say anything and speak out publicly, because he saw what happened to Adam Goodes. But he said that every time he was subjected to a racist attack, he felt like he was drowning inside. And it wasn't until he was 28 that he felt that he had the confidence to be able to come out and really take a strong stand against racism and try to encourage others to actually change their mindset. Now, in the past, he has said that this is going to be a very long and slow process. This is what he has had to say.
Really about starting those conversations within household, the younger generation, because I said if I can't change the older generation, if I can't educate the older generation, let's start with the new generation coming through and educate them, and that's where they can, you know, have those conversations within their households and with their friends, with family, and grow from then. And I think we'll slowly make change. It'll be a long time. It'll be a long process.
And that empathy and compassion reaching out is even more stark when you think about some of the taunts that he suffered. I mean, there was that infamous time when someone even threw a banana on the field at him during the showdown when he was playing for the Crows against Port back in 2016. That fan ended up facing an lifetime ban for what the AFL called an unambiguous racist taunt. But it also shows the mettle of the man, that he is, even after this has happened to children, to be able to say, you know, if people know who it is, to come out and let him know so that he can have a conversation with them, because he's obviously constantly trying to take that higher ground, rise above it and educate people.
Steph Ferrier, thank you.
And, you know, we need to be able to think about what Eddie has said, that it's important to have a conversation about all of this, and I couldn't agree more. But it's not helpful for people like Andrew Bolt to say what they're doing. It's the equivalent of throwing a banana peel onto a ground, and that person being banned. Actually, Andrew Bolt needs to be banned from any appearances whatsoever. That will never happen, particularly now that he's on the Liberal Party TV network. But certainly, people like myself need to make a stand, and we need to be able to say what we need to say about racism in this country, and we need to stand up for First Nations people. Now, there'll be many people that will be disagreeing with me, and there'll be many comments here in the comment section. For those people that have bothered to go through this whole video, which is now some 32 minutes. But if you have got a view, I'd be more than happy to hear what you have to say. But what I'd be really interested in hearing is whether or not you believe that there is a solution to these problems, and whether or not you believe the type of rhetoric we hear from people like Bolt is propagating racism in this country, and that somehow we need to find a way to stop it. I'm doing my bit through my YouTube channel, of which I don't have all that many subscribers, but I don't care. I'm still doing it. So subscribe to my channel, make some comments below. Be happy to hear from you. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.